The end of Henry VIII did not arrive with a trumpet blast. It came slowly in the heavy silence of a winter room, beneath the eyes of men who had spent their lives bowing before him and were now forced to watch him fail. By January 1547, the great King of England was no longer the towering figure who had once ridden through London in armor, who had dazzled Europe with youth and confidence, who had thundered against popes, ministers, and enemies alike. The body that once seemed built for command had become a prison. His legs swelled, his strength vanished, his temper remained, but even that seemed trapped inside flesh that would no longer obey him. The Lion of England, once so loud in life, was being reduced to breath, to pain, to silence. And around him, everything he had made was waiting. Waiting for the boy who would inherit the crown. Waiting for the daughters he had once cast aside, then restored, then feared. Waiting for the kingdom he had dragged out of the old world and into a new one. Waiting for the final judgment of history. Henry VIII died in Whitehall Palace on January 28, 1547, but the moment carried the weight of a much larger ending. It was not only the death of a king, it was the closing of an age. The man who had once seemed capable of bending the entire world to his will had spent nearly 4 decades remaking England according to his own desire, his own fear, and his own stubborn belief that power belonged to the strongest hand in the room. He had broken with Rome, he had destroyed monasteries, he had reordered the church, the court, and the succession. He had outlived wives, ministers, friends, and rivals. In the end, he had even outlived the certainty that had defined him. If a simple image could capture the moment, it would be this: a king in a dark chamber, heavy with pain, while the future stands outside the door. On one side of that door was the England Henry VIII had known as a child, a kingdom still haunted by civil war, still cautious, still young in the fragile life of the Tudor dynasty. On the other side was the England he was leaving behind, more centralized, more suspicious, more self-confident, and far more dangerous than the one he had inherited. Between those two worlds stood Henry himself, the bridge and the fire, the architect and the destroyer. The question that hangs over his story is not whether he mattered. Of course he mattered. No English ruler after William the Conqueror left a deeper mark on the nation. The real question is what kind of mark he left. Was he the king who built modern England, giving the crown greater authority and forcing the kingdom to define itself on new terms? Or was he the king who shattered an older, more stable world because his own needs, fears, and ambitions could not be satisfied within it? That question matters because Henry VIII was never only a figure of ceremony. He was never merely a name in a textbook or a face in a painted portrait. His reign was lived by real people who had something at stake every time he made a decision. A queen could lose her marriage, her status, and her life. A minister could rise from obscurity or fall to execution. A monk could lose his home. A noble family could gain wealth or vanish from favor. A common subject could find the rituals of faith altered in ways that changed the shape of daily life. In Henry's England, no one stood entirely outside the reach of the king's will. That is what makes his story so compelling. It is not simply the tale of a man with 6 wives. It is the tale of a kingdom forced to bend around one ruler's desires. It is the story of private longing turning into public revolution. It is the story of a crown that became stronger by becoming harsher. It is the story of a king who wanted security and found instead that power only multiplied his fears. To understand Henry VIII, the story must begin not at the beginning, but at the end. It begins in a room where a dying king can no longer rise from his bed. It begins with the knowledge that the body has failed, even while the consequences of his choices continue to move through the kingdom like weather. It begins with the unsettling realization that by the time Henry died, England had already become something different from the country he had inherited. And yet that transformation did not begin in sickness. It began in youth. It began with a boy who was never meant to rule. It began with a prince who came to the throne unexpectedly, in a season of hope, before the first fracture appeared, before the divorces, before the break with Rome, before the executions, before the kingdom learned what kind of king Henry VIII would become. The story of Henry VIII is the story of how one man's life could alter the course of a nation. But before the king became feared across Europe, before he became a symbol of absolutism, before he became a widower 6 times over, he was something else entirely. He was England's future, and at the start, that future looked bright. Henry VIII began life as a second son. That detail mattered more than it first appears, because in the world of kings, birth order could decide the fate of nations. The first son was the future. The first son was the name written into the ledgers, the face expected in the crown, the boy everyone watched with careful, anxious hope. The second son was something else. Important, certainly. Valuable, perhaps. But not essential in the same way. He was the spare, the reserve, the one who mattered most only if the first one failed. That was Henry at the beginning. He was born on the 28th of June, 1491 at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich during the reign of Henry VII, the first Tudor king. England itself was still recovering from the long violence of the Wars of the Roses, those bitter civil conflicts that had torn the nobility apart and left the country hungry for stability. The Tudors had taken the throne only a few years earlier, and their grip on power, though secure enough to survive, was still young enough to remember fear. Every royal child mattered in a kingdom like that. Every marriage mattered, every birth mattered, every death could tilt the balance of the future. Henry's elder brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales, had been born to be king. He carried the expectations of a dynasty still proving itself. He was being raised as the living answer to the question of whether the Tudors would endure. Henry, by contrast, was being shaped for another role. He was meant to serve the family's security, not its destiny. If Arthur lived and produced sons of his own, Henry would likely remain important but secondary. Perhaps a prince of dignity and usefulness, one of those royal sons who could be married well, placed carefully, and used to strengthen the Tudor position. For a long time, that was all Henry needed to be. That space opened in 1502 when Arthur died at the age of 15. The boy who had been raised for kingship was suddenly gone, and the Tudor future was thrown into uncertainty. In an instant, Henry became the heir. It is difficult to overstate what that meant. The child who had been allowed some freedom as a younger son now had the full burden of dynastic survival placed on his shoulders. The kingdom did not merely need him to succeed. It needed him to produce sons. It needed him to continue the Tudor line. It needed him to prevent the old chaos from returning. In the shadow of the Wars of the Roses, a royal failure was never simply personal. It was political danger wearing a human face. Henry was not yet a man when he became the center of those expectations. He was still a boy, and his childhood had already carried grief. His mother, Elizabeth of York, died when he was 11. His older brother was gone. The court that surrounded him was full of ceremony, but ceremony did not soften loss. It arranged it neatly. It covered fear with silk and gold. It taught a prince how to appear strong even when the future itself was fragile. He received an education fit for a future ruler. He was trained in languages, theology, music, and courtly behavior. He learned to present himself with confidence, to dance, to hunt, to ride, to command the language of majesty that kings were expected to wear as naturally as robes. He was bright, handsome, and physically impressive as he grew. Later portraits would emphasize the broad shoulders, the strong face, and the confident gaze. Even before he became a king of legend, he carried the visible promise of energy. People looked at him and imagined movement, force, abundance. That promise mattered because England had spent too long living under the memory of rupture. Henry VII had ruled carefully, even suspiciously, because he knew how easily a throne could be challenged. His son inherited not only a crown, but a political atmosphere. It was a kingdom of controlled nobles, carefully managed alliances, and deep concern for order. The Tudors were not merely a family. They were a solution to national trauma. Henry VIII, as heir, was meant to embody that solution. Then, in 1509, the old king died, and everything changed again. Henry VIII was 17 when he came to the throne. Young, vigorous, and full of confidence, he stepped into power at a moment that seemed to invite celebration. The long, cautious reign of Henry VII gave way to something altogether brighter in public imagination. England greeted the new king with excitement. Here was a prince who seemed made for display. He was tall, athletic, and flamboyant where his father had been restrained. He loved jousting, music, fine clothing, and the pageantry of kingship. He looked like a Renaissance monarch. He seemed to belong to a larger and more glamorous Europe. If Henry VII had ruled like a banker who feared disorder, Henry VIII arrived like a prince determined to enjoy the world before it could take anything from him. That contrast shaped the early mood of the reign. In a short time, the kingdom began to feel as though it had entered a warmer season. A young king on the throne meant more than age. It meant motion. It meant confidence. It meant the possibility that England, long cautious and inward-looking, might become bold. At court, energy gathered around him. Nobles sought favor. Foreign ambassadors watched carefully. Everyone knew that a young king could change direction quickly, and those who stood nearest to him might rise with him. But the young king's rise also carried the seed of danger. A man who begins life as the spare often grows up with something to prove. He may never fully escape the knowledge that he was once optional. In Henry's case, that pressure met a personality already inclined toward certainty, vanity, and strength. He wanted to be admired. He wanted to be taken seriously. He wanted, above all, to be more than a replacement for a dead brother. That desire would shape everything that followed. For now, however, the world saw only the promise. The young king entered his reign surrounded by hope, and the kingdom, eager to believe in its future, answered with applause. Yet even in those early years, the shape of the story was already visible. A boy who had not been meant to rule had inherited a throne, and a throne had inherited him in return. The Tudor dynasty had survived one crisis, but the greater test was still waiting. And in the royal households, in the councils of Europe, and in the quiet calculations of a nation hoping for peace, one question began to gather force. What kind of king would this boy become, now that the crown had chosen him? There are reigns that begin in winter, and there are reigns that begin in spring. Henry VIII's seemed to belong to the second kind. When he came to the throne in 1509, England was ready to believe in brightness again. The new king was young enough to suggest a fresh age, strong enough to seem unafraid of the future, and wealthy enough in inherited promise to make people imagine that the Tudors had finally reached stable ground. The court around him felt charged with motion, as though the whole kingdom had inhaled deeply after years of caution. This was not simply a change of ruler, it was a change in atmosphere. A visual of the moment would almost draw itself, a sunlit royal procession moving through London, banners lifted above the streets, crowds pressing forward for a better view, the new king riding at the center of the city like a figure from a story just beginning. The old anxieties of Henry VII's reign did not vanish, but they receded for a time behind color, ceremony, and youth. Henry VIII looked the part of a prince lifted straight out of a dream of Renaissance kingship. He was tall, strong, handsome, and eager to be seen. Where his father had moved carefully, Henry moved as though the world was a stage built for him. That mattered. A king in the early 16th century was not judged by policy alone. He was judged by appearance, by energy, by the impression he gave in motion. Henry understood this instinctively. He lived in public. He dressed with deliberate magnificence. He rode, hunted, jousted, danced, and performed the physical confidence expected of a monarch who wanted his subjects and his peers to feel that the crown was in capable hands. He did not merely occupy kingship, he inhabited it with almost theatrical force. And at the beginning, that force seemed to promise everything England wanted. The country still remembered the dangers of civil war, the fractures left by the Wars of the Roses, the unstable decades when noble families had fought over the throne and power had seemed brittle. Henry VII had secured the dynasty through careful management, strategic marriages, and political discipline. Henry VIII inherited the reward for that caution. He did not have to prove the Tudors belonged on the throne in the same anxious way his father had. He could begin instead by making the crown feel radiant. He could turn monarchy into spectacle again. That was one of the reasons the early years of his reign felt so hopeful. The kingdom saw a king who looked like youth itself. It saw a ruler who seemed to combine learning, vigor, and wealth in one impressive figure. It saw a court becoming brighter, more international, more confident. Ambassadors noticed the difference. So did nobles. So did ordinary people who understood that a strong-looking king could mean a stable future. But this springtime feeling was never free of strain. Beneath the celebration lay a deeper pressure. Henry was not just any young ruler. He was a Tudor king, which meant he inherited not only authority, but expectation. The dynasty still depended on continuity. The memory of instability was still close enough to matter. A king could be admired for his appearance and still be judged by the same old question: could he secure the line? At first, that question did not seem urgent. Henry married Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his dead brother Arthur, and the union carried both political and emotional weight. It connected England to Spain and tied the new reign to an alliance with one of Europe's great powers. It also gave the court a sense that history had been neatly repaired. The brother who had died was, in a sense, being answered. The dynasty had found a way forward. For a moment, that seemed enough. Yet the early promise of the reign was built on something fragile: confidence. Confidence can be a magnificent thing in a king. It can also become a trap. Henry's certainty in himself, which made him so dazzling at first, would later harden into something less useful and more dangerous. In the springtime of his reign, however, that confidence looked like vitality. He was the kind of ruler who made people expect great things. He was educated, energetic, and eager to be admired. He lived in a world of tournaments, music, and elaborate ceremonial display, where each public appearance reinforced the sense that England had entered a more splendid age. If the reign were mapped visually, this was the broad high point at the top of the curve. A new king, a stable succession on the surface, a court radiating ambition, and a nation looking outward with greater self-assurance. The line would not yet show the fracture beneath it. That part comes later. For now, the picture is one of ascent. Still, spring is never permanent. The same warmth that makes a season bloom can also hide the pressure building underneath. Henry's youth gave him charm, but it also gave him urgency. He wanted distinction. He wanted triumph. He wanted his reign to matter in a world crowded with powerful rivals. To achieve that, he would need not only admiration, but legacy. And legacy in a monarchy meant children, especially sons. That need was already waiting in the background, quiet but persistent. A king could be glorious, but if the line failed, glory would sour into anxiety. The court might celebrate a magnificent marriage, but the kingdom would keep counting time by pregnancies, births, and deaths. In a Tudor world, the body of the queen mattered as much as any army. Her fertility could alter the fate of the realm. The early reign still shimmered with possibility, but there was already a shadow at its edge. At the center of Henry VIII's early reign stood a marriage that, for a while, seemed to solve everything. Catherine of Aragon was not a dramatic romance dreamt up in a palace hallway. She was something far more important in the world Henry inhabited, a political answer. She brought legitimacy, experience, prestige, and a powerful European connection. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the monarchs who had helped shape a new age of power on the continent. She had first come to England as the widow of Henry's elder brother, Arthur, and that fact alone gave the marriage a complicated, almost fateful aura. It linked Henry to his brother's memory. It tied the Tudors to Spain. It suggested continuity where once there had been uncertainty. For Henry, the marriage likely held another kind of promise as well. Catherine was pious, dignified, intelligent, and experienced enough to understand the court world she entered. She had already endured loss, including the death of Arthur, and she carried herself with a quiet strength that made her more than a ceremonial figure. In the early years of her marriage to Henry, the union may well have felt stable, even affectionate. The young king, full of confidence and ambition, had a queen who seemed to fit the role perfectly. Together, they gave the impression of a dynasty settling into its rightful shape. That impression mattered. A royal couple could become a symbol. They could make a kingdom feel ordered. They could reassure nobles, clergy, and foreign powers that the future was secure. And at first, Henry and Catherine seemed capable of doing exactly that. But beneath the ceremony was the central pressure of Tudor life. A queen could be admired, respected, even beloved, but if she did not produce a living son, the entire structure of dynastic hope began to wobble. That was the terrible arithmetic of monarchy. It did not care about appearances. It counted survival. It counted heirs. Catherine knew this as well as anyone. She gave birth several times, but the children who survived infancy did not. The deaths came quietly, privately, and with devastating force. Each loss narrowed the line of hope. Each child who died made the next pregnancy feel heavier. The court might continue to shine in public, but inside it, anxiety deepened. The question no one could escape was whether the Tudor future would continue through Henry and Catherine or break on the edge of one more failed birth. Only one child, Princess Mary, survived infancy. Her survival was a blessing, but it was not enough to quiet the larger fear. In a kingdom still shaped by memories of succession conflict, a daughter could matter deeply, but she did not solve the same problem a son did. England understood this. Catherine understood it. Henry understood it most of all. At first, he likely tried to answer that fear with patience. Kings are trained to act as though time belongs to them, but dynastic anxiety has a way of eroding confidence. What begins as hope can slowly become dread. Every year without a surviving son made the future feel less like a promise and more like a question. The marriage that had once seemed to secure everything now carried the weight of everything that might still go wrong. What made this dangerous was not simply that Henry wanted a son, it was that the entire political order depended on one. Without a male heir, the Tudors remained vulnerable. The kingdom could face a disputed succession. Foreign powers could exploit the uncertainty. Noble factions could begin calculating again. The old wounds of England's civil wars were not just history, they were warnings. And in Henry's mind, those warnings became increasingly personal. He was not the kind of man who waited comfortably with uncertainty. He was proud, restless, and deeply invested in the image of himself as a strong, divinely favored king. The longer the marriage failed to deliver a surviving son, the more the failure seemed to imply something about him. His authority was real, but it was still human. It still depended on bodies that could not always be commanded. Catherine's body, his own body, the bodies of their children, all of it became part of the same political equation. In a monarchy, private disappointment can become public danger with astonishing speed. By the time Henry began to think seriously about the future of the marriage, the issue had moved far beyond personal sadness. It had become a question of dynastic survival, religious authority, diplomatic consequence, and the king's own sense of himself. Catherine had given him loyalty and prestige. Mary had given him a daughter he loved. But the one thing he needed most remained out of reach. And once the need for a son hardened into obsession, the marriage stopped being a solution. It became a problem. The court could feel it. Europe could feel it. And in the silence that followed each failed hope, the shape of a far greater crisis began to emerge. Because Henry VIII was about to decide that if the marriage could not give him what he wanted, then the world around the marriage would have to change instead. In Henry VIII's world, a son was never just a child. He was a future crowned in advance. He was the difference between continuity and chaos, between a dynasty that could believe in itself and a dynasty that might be remembered as a brief interruption in a violent age. For Henry, the search for a son was not a private preference. It was the central pressure of his reign, the question that sat beneath every celebration, every ceremony, every smile at court. The kingdom could enjoy tournaments, music, diplomacy, and spectacle, but behind all of it ran the same hard calculation. Who would inherit? That question gave Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon its tragic shape. It was no longer simply a union of alliance and respect. It was a race against time, and time was winning. In the early years of the marriage, hope had not yet died. Royal families lived by hope because hope was part of the machinery of power. A pregnancy was not just a personal event, but a political one. Courtiers waited, ambassadors reported, foreign rulers watched. The shape of Europe itself could shift depending on whether a queen delivered a healthy child or not. When Catherine became pregnant, the court would have felt the sudden tightening of collective breath. When a child was born, joy mixed immediately with calculation. Was it a boy? Would the child live? Would the child survive the dangerous first days and weeks when so many infants did not? The Tudor court knew the answer could not be assumed. One of the most painful truths of Henry's marriage was that it was haunted by repetition. Birth followed by hope, hope followed by fear, fear followed by loss. In an era when infant mortality was common, royal life was no exception to ordinary human fragility. If anything, it exposed that fragility more sharply. A prince's cradle was not a place of certainty, but of suspense. A surviving son could change everything. A dead son could deepen the crisis. Mary's survival mattered greatly, especially to her mother and father, but it could not fully calm the kingdom. A daughter was not nothing. Far from it. She could strengthen alliances, preserve bloodlines, and one day, if circumstances demanded, inherit. Yet under the assumptions of Tudor politics, she did not solve the deepest danger. The realm still looked to the male line as the safest path forward. That expectation may seem brutally narrow from a modern perspective, but in Henry's time it was part of the political grammar of monarchy. The king understood that grammar perfectly, and so the pressure mounted. What made the situation more dangerous was that the failure to produce a son could not be blamed on one obvious source. In the logic of the age, it became a kind of shared shadow. Henry was healthy, vigorous, and convinced of his own strength. Catherine was dutiful, pious, and long past the age of a youthful bride. The court could not openly say what people may have whispered in private. Perhaps the fault lay in the marriage itself, or in providence, or in some hidden judgment that no one wished to name. When no answer is possible, suspicion spreads. For Henry, that suspicion had consequences far beyond emotion. A king who had no secure heir was a king whose future authority could be questioned. Foreign rivals knew it. Domestic factions knew it. The nobility knew it. Even the calmest courtier would have understood that a succession crisis could pull old tensions back to the surface. England had been through enough dynastic instability in living memory to know how quickly uncertainty could become danger. The memory of civil war was never far away. It hung over the Tudor court like a storm cloud that no one could fully disperse. That is why the search for a son became so consuming. It was not merely about fatherhood in the personal sense. It was about survival, legitimacy, and fear. Henry wanted not just a child, but a guarantee. He wanted the future made visible in flesh. He wanted the kingdom to stop asking the question that haunted every reign. What happens if the king dies too soon? The problem was that history does not grant guarantees. As the years passed, Henry's anxiety deepened into something harder and more dangerous. He was not a man who accepted limits gracefully. He was a king accustomed to command, and command could do many things, but it could not command biology. It could not promise a male child. It could not undo grief. It could not turn the body into a political instrument that never failed. Yet Henry's temperament made him increasingly unwilling to live with uncertainty. He wanted an answer. He wanted a solution. He wanted the world to make sense according to the force of his will. That desire changed the atmosphere at court. The marriage, once a source of stability, began to feel heavy with expectation. Catherine's dignity did not disappear, but it now lived under strain. Henry's affection, if it remained, was increasingly entangled with frustration. Everyone near the throne would have sensed the shift. Small silences lengthened. Conversations became careful. Every pregnancy became a matter of state. Every loss became a deeper wound. And that is what made Henry dangerous at this stage. Not because he was already acting openly, but because he was becoming inwardly convinced that the ordinary order of things could not remain as it was. If the marriage failed him, then something must be wrong with the marriage. If the marriage was wrong, then the church that had sanctioned it could be challenged. If the church could be challenged, then the king might find a way to remake the rules themselves. The search for a son was never only a search for a child. It was the beginning of Henry VIII's confrontation with limits. And once he turned that struggle into a matter of principle, the kingdom itself would begin to change shape. At first, Henry VIII did not set out to break a church. He set out to solve a problem. That distinction matters because the crisis that would eventually split England from Rome began not as a theological revolution, but as a royal desperation. The English court called it the king's great matter, a phrase that sounds formal and restrained, almost polite. In truth, it concealed one of the most dangerous questions in European history. Could a king persuade the world to declare his marriage invalid after years of treating it as lawful? This was no small matter of ceremony. It was the knot around which Henry's entire future tightened. If his marriage to Catherine of Aragon could be undone, then the path would open toward a new wife, a new pregnancy, and the son he believed the kingdom needed to survive. If it could not, then he remained trapped inside a marriage that time had turned into a dead end. Henry's argument rested on the claim that his marriage to Catherine had always been wrong. He pointed to the fact that Catherine had first been married to his brother, Arthur. Under biblical law, as Henry read it, a man should not marry his brother's widow. That idea gave his desire a moral shape. It allowed him to present his personal frustration as a question of conscience. He was not merely seeking a new wife, or so he claimed. He was seeking the removal of an unlawful union that had offended God from the start. But the problem was never that simple. For years, the marriage had been accepted. Catherine had lived as queen. Henry had lived as her husband. The union had been celebrated, not hidden. To declare it invalid now would mean admitting that the church, the crown, and the wider Christian world had all been mistaken. That was not just embarrassing. It was destabilizing. If the church could be wrong about this, what else could it be wrong about? And if the king could challenge one's sacred decision, where would such a challenge end? That is what made the great matter so explosive. It was a legal argument that touched the foundations of authority. The Pope stood at the center of the crisis. In Henry's world, the Pope was not only a religious figure, but the highest arbiter in Christendom on questions of marriage and legitimacy. Yet the papacy was not free to act without political consequence. The timing was disastrous. Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, and he had no intention of seeing his aunt humiliated. The Pope, caught between Henry's demands and the Emperor's pressure, moved carefully, and in moving carefully, he infuriated the king. This is where the story becomes tense in a very human way. Henry wanted certainty. Rome offered delay. Henry wanted an answer. Rome offered procedure. Henry wanted the machinery of authority to bend quickly to his will. Instead, it resisted. That resistance changed everything. The court around Henry began to feel the weight of the struggle. Cardinals came and went. Lawyers argued over scripture and precedent. Letters crossed borders. Ambassadors reported every shift in mood. A simple scene could capture the atmosphere. Parchment spread across a table, candles burning low, men speaking in careful voices while the entire kingdom waits outside the door. No cannon fire, no marching armies, just language, pressure, and the slow grinding of institutions against one another. At the heart of it all was Henry himself, growing less patient by the year. He had begun with hope that the church would grant him what he wanted. He believed, perhaps genuinely, that his case was sound. He also believed that his status as king should count for something. A ruler used to obedience does not adapt easily to refusal. The more the process stalled, the more he came to see not a legal obstacle, but an insult. If the church would not act in his favor, then perhaps the church was no longer acting in God's favor. If the Pope could be opposed, then perhaps the king's conscience itself would become the stronger authority. That idea was far more dangerous than any marriage dispute. It transformed a domestic crisis into a constitutional one. It gave Henry a reason to challenge the framework of religious power in England. It also gave ambitious ministers, especially Thomas Cromwell, room to imagine a new relationship between crown and church. Once the king began to think in this direction, the possibilities widened rapidly. A solution that had once seemed impossible now started to look necessary. If Rome would not help Henry, then Henry might simply remove Rome from the equation. The tragedy is that the people nearest to him could already feel the world shifting under their feet. Catherine stood in an impossible position. She had not merely been a wife, she had been queen for many years, a loyal and dignified presence whose legitimacy was now being attacked by the husband she had served. To lose the marriage was to lose her status, her home, and the public truth of her life. She defended herself with quiet resolve, but the machinery of power was moving against her. Mary, too, stood in the shadow of the great matter. Her future depended on whether her mother's marriage would be recognized or erased. If Henry succeeded, Mary's position might be weakened or redefined. If he failed, the succession remained uncertain. Either way, the child who had survived infancy could not escape the political storm gathering over her family. And then there was the broader court, where every noble household understood that the outcome would create winners and losers. Men who supported Henry's cause might rise. Those who defended Catherine might fall. Clergymen, lawyers, and courtiers all had to decide where their loyalties lay, and some of them would pay dearly for choosing wrongly. In Henry's England, politics was never just abstract. It was personal, material, and often fatal. That is the real turning point. The great matter was never only about whether Henry could leave Catherine. It was about who had the final say in England. Henry had come seeking a son. Instead, he found a path to revolution. And soon the woman who would make that revolution personal, visible, and irreversible would step from the shadows of the court into the center of his destiny. Henry VIII had begun with a marriage problem, but by now, the danger had grown far larger than one queen, one pope, or even one child. What had once looked like a private struggle was turning into a contest over power itself. If the king could not be given what he wanted through the old channels, then he would look for another way. And just as the walls around Catherine began to close, another figure was rising at court, sharp, ambitious, impossible to ignore. Her name would soon be spoken everywhere, and with her arrival, Henry's personal crisis would become a national storm. Before Anne Boleyn became a queen, she became an idea. That was her real power. She was not the most conventionally beautiful woman at court. Contemporary descriptions vary, and later generations would argue endlessly about her appearance. Yet those debates missed the point. Anne's influence did not come from fitting an ideal of beauty. It came from something harder to define and much harder to resist. She possessed intelligence, confidence, wit, and an ability to command attention in rooms filled with people competing for notice. In a court built around performance, Anne knew how to stand out. By the time she entered Henry VIII's life in a serious way, the king was already wrestling with the frustrations of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The search for a son had become an obsession. The great matter had become a political crisis. The future seemed uncertain. Into that uncertainty stepped Anne, and suddenly the king's private hopes acquired a face. Anne understood that world exceptionally well. Unlike many women who attracted royal attention, Anne refused to become merely another passing affair. This was the decision that changed everything. Henry had known mistresses before. The court expected kings to have them. Such relationships created gossip, jealousy, and occasional political complications, but they did not normally threaten the foundations of a kingdom. Anne was different. Whether from conviction, ambition, caution, or a combination of all three, she refused to become Henry's mistress. If he wanted her, he would have to offer something more substantial. The refusal transformed desire into determination. For Henry, who was accustomed to getting his way, the challenge was intoxicating. Anne became more than a woman he wanted. She became a symbol of possibility. She represented youth where Catherine represented the passing years. She represented fertility where Henry increasingly saw disappointment. She represented a future that had not yet failed him. That distinction matters. Historians often ask whether Henry truly loved Anne Boleyn. The answer is complicated because Henry rarely separated love from possession, desire from ambition, or affection from expectation. What is clear is that he became deeply captivated by her. His surviving letters reveal an intensity unusual even for him. They show a man consumed by longing, impatience, and hope. For years, while his case against Catherine dragged through legal and religious channels, Anne remained at the center of his imagination. The court noticed. How could it not? Every glance, every conversation, every gesture became part of a wider drama. Courtiers quickly understood that Anne's fortunes were rising. Families began positioning themselves accordingly. Friendships shifted. Alliances formed. Those closest to Anne gained influence. Those loyal to Catherine watched with increasing alarm. The court itself seemed to be changing shape around her. Yet Anne's rise was not merely a story of romance. It was also a story of ideas. Anne had spent time in continental Europe, particularly in the sophisticated courts of France. She brought with her new tastes, new influences, and exposure to intellectual currents moving through Renaissance Europe. She was interested in religious reform, supported scholars with reformist sympathies, and encouraged discussions that would have seemed dangerous in earlier generations. This did not make her a revolutionary in the modern sense, but it did make her part of a changing world. Europe itself was undergoing profound transformation. New religious debates were spreading. Traditional authorities were being questioned. The printing press carried ideas farther and faster than before. Old certainties seemed less secure. Anne stood at the intersection of these developments, and her presence gave reform-minded figures new opportunities to influence the king. That is why her significance extends beyond her relationship with Henry. She became a focal point around which larger forces gathered. For traditionalists, Anne represented danger. She threatened Catherine's position, challenged established expectations, and seemed connected to unsettling religious ideas. For reformers, she represented opportunity. Through her, England might move toward a different future. For Henry, she represented hope, and hope can be one of the most powerful forces in history. Because Henry did not simply want Anne, he wanted what Anne appeared to promise. He wanted a legitimate male heir. He wanted an end to uncertainty. He wanted confirmation that God favored his reign. He wanted the future made secure. Everything became connected to that desire. The great matter was no longer an abstract legal dispute. It now had a living center. Every delay from Rome felt more frustrating because Anne waited. Every obstacle seemed more intolerable because Anne represented the solution Henry believed he needed. The king's emotional investment merged with his political objectives until separating the two became impossible. This made the situation extraordinarily dangerous. When a ruler begins to see personal desire and national necessity as the same thing, compromise becomes difficult. Opposition becomes easier to interpret as betrayal. Institutions that resist begin to look like enemies. The normal checks on power weaken because the ruler convinces himself that his own wishes are aligned with the kingdom's survival. That process was already underway. By the late 1520s and early 1530s, the atmosphere at court had become charged with anticipation. Everyone understood that something significant was approaching. The old order still existed, but it felt increasingly fragile. Catherine remained queen in name, yet her position was under constant pressure. Anne had not yet reached the throne, yet her influence was already reshaping politics. The kingdom stood between two worlds. One was the familiar England of the past, connected to Rome, governed by long-established traditions, and anchored by institutions that had endured for centuries. The other was still emerging, visible only in fragments and possibilities. Anne Boleyn stood at the threshold between them, and as her rise continued, the question facing England became impossible to ignore. What would Henry VIII be willing to destroy in order to obtain the future he believed awaited him? The answer was about to change the course of English history forever. Because the next step would not simply elevate Anne Boleyn, it would sever England from Rome. For nearly 1,000 years, England had been part of a larger spiritual world. Its churches looked toward Rome. Its bishops answered ultimately to the authority of the Pope. Its kings ruled kingdoms, but the church belonged to something greater than any kingdom. Generations had been born, married, worshipped, and buried within that reality. It was so deeply woven into everyday life that most people could scarcely imagine an alternative. Then one king decided that the old arrangement could no longer serve his purposes, and England changed forever. The break with Rome did not happen in a single dramatic moment. There was no thunderclap, no lone declaration that instantly transformed the nation. Instead, it unfolded step by step, law by law, decision by decision. Like a bridge being dismantled, plank by plank, until one day people looked back and realized the crossing no longer existed. What made the process remarkable was that it began with such a specific goal. Henry VIII still wanted what he had wanted for years: freedom from his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and the opportunity to secure a male heir through Anne Boleyn. Yet the longer Rome delayed, the more Henry's frustration hardened into principle. What had started as a request became a challenge. What had begun as a legal dispute became a question of sovereignty. Who truly ruled England? That question now stood at the center of the crisis. The first stages of the confrontation were subtle. Henry's advisors, particularly Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, began developing arguments that expanded royal authority while reducing dependence on Rome. Parliament became an increasingly important instrument. Laws were passed that gradually restricted the ability of the papacy to exercise influence within England. To many observers at the time, these measures may have seemed technical or temporary. They were neither. Each law shifted the balance slightly further toward the king. Each decision reinforced the idea that England could govern its religious affairs without foreign intervention. Each step made the next one easier. The process accelerated in the early 1530s. In 1533, Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn. The marriage itself was an extraordinary gamble. Catherine was still widely regarded as the lawful queen. Rome had not granted the annulment Henry wanted. Yet the king had reached a point where waiting no longer seemed acceptable. Soon afterward, Thomas Cranmer, newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid and recognized Anne as the rightful queen. The significance of that decision cannot be overstated. For years, Henry had sought approval from Rome. Now England had effectively judged the matter for itself. A line had been crossed. The old order was beginning to fracture. Then came the decisive step. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring Henry VIII the supreme head of the Church of England. The words themselves may appear simple, but their consequences were enormous. For centuries, the Pope had occupied the highest position of religious authority within Western Christendom. Now the English king claimed that role within his own realm. Spiritual authority and political authority were being drawn together under one crown. What made this moment so revolutionary was that it altered more than government. It changed how power itself was understood. Before, a king ruled under God while sharing the religious landscape with an international church structure. After the break, Henry increasingly presented himself as both political ruler and supreme authority over the English church. The implications were profound. If the king could define religious authority, then opposition to royal policy could become opposition to the church itself. Loyalty to the Pope could be interpreted as disloyalty to the crown. Questions that had once belonged primarily to theologians suddenly became matters of state security. This was dangerous territory. Not everyone accepted the new reality. Some complied reluctantly. Others welcomed the change. Still others resisted. Among the most famous opponents was Sir Thomas More, one of the most respected intellectuals in Europe. More had served Henry faithfully and admired many aspects of the king's rule. Yet he could not accept the claim that Henry possessed supreme authority over the church. His refusal came at a terrible price. When More declined to swear the required oath recognizing Henry's position, he was imprisoned and eventually executed. His death sent a clear message throughout the kingdom. The debate was over. The king expected obedience. What had once been disagreement could now become treason. Thomas More was not alone. Bishops, monks, priests, and ordinary believers faced difficult choices. Some accepted the changes out of conviction. Others complied out of necessity. Many struggled privately with conflicting loyalties. For ordinary people, the transformation was often confusing. Most villagers were not theologians. Most worshippers did not spend their days debating ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Yet they could sense that something fundamental was happening. Familiar rituals were questioned. Traditional assumptions felt less secure. The relationship between crown, church, and community was being redefined. And all of this traced back to a king's determination to secure his future. That is one of the great ironies of history. Henry had sought a solution to a dynastic problem. Instead, he triggered a religious revolution. He wanted a son. He ended up changing the structure of English Christianity. He wanted freedom from one marriage. He altered the relationship between church and state for centuries. The break with Rome was not merely an episode in Henry's personal story. It was the moment England began moving down a path that would shape its politics, culture, and identity long after Henry himself was gone. Yet even now, the transformation was only beginning. The old church still possessed immense wealth. The monasteries still dotted the landscape. The ancient rhythms of religious life still continued across much of the kingdom. If Henry intended to secure his revolution, he would need to go further. And soon, the most dramatic assault on the old religious order would begin, not in the courts of Europe or the chambers of Parliament, but in the monasteries, abbeys, and religious houses that had stood at the heart of English life for generations. After the break with Rome, England did not simply change its religious alignment. It changed its physical and economic landscape. The monasteries were everywhere, rising from valleys, sitting beside rivers, standing at the edges of towns and farmland. They formed a network that had shaped English life for centuries. They were not only places of prayer, they were centers of learning, charity, agriculture, medicine, and local stability. For many communities, they were as much a part of daily survival as they were of spiritual life. Then the crown decided they would no longer exist. This was the most visible and disruptive phase of Henry VIII's transformation of England. If the break with Rome was a political and theological rupture, the dissolution of the monasteries was its material consequence. It brought ideology into stone, land, and livelihood. It turned doctrine into demolition. The process began in the 1530s under the direction of the king's ministers, particularly Thomas Cromwell. Officially, the monasteries were investigated for corruption, inefficiency, and moral decline. Reports were produced describing abuses and irregularities. Whether these accounts fully reflected reality is still debated, but in political terms, they served a clear purpose: justification. Once the monasteries were declared problematic, their removal could be framed not as destruction, but as reform. And reform was a powerful word in Henry's England. What followed was one of the most significant transfers of property in English history. Monastic lands, wealth, and buildings were taken into royal control. Some were destroyed, others were repurposed. Many were sold or granted to nobles and courtiers who supported the crown. In a relatively short period of time, vast portions of England's land changed hands. What makes this transformation so striking is not only its scale, but its effect on everyday life. The monasteries had provided alms for the poor, hospitality for travelers, and a structure of care that many communities relied upon. When they disappeared, that support did not simply reappear elsewhere in the same form. New systems would eventually emerge, but in the immediate aftermath, many local economies and social networks were disrupted. For those who benefited from the redistribution of land, however, the changes were transformative in a different way. Noble families and emerging landowners gained property and influence. The crown gained revenue and leverage. A new class of wealth began to take shape, tied more closely to royal favor than to traditional ecclesiastical authority. In this sense, Henry's England did not merely lose monasteries, it gained a new power structure. One of the most important consequences of this shift was the strengthening of the monarchy itself. By absorbing church wealth and redistributing land, the crown increased its financial and political reach. Henry VIII became not only a king who ruled over England, but one whose authority extended deeply into its economic foundations. This was a different kind of kingship from the one he inherited. Henry VII had worked carefully to stabilize the monarchy through control and caution. Henry VIII, especially after the break with Rome, moved towards something more expansive. His crown was no longer simply the highest political office in the land. It had become the center of both political and religious authority, supported by a growing network of loyalty, property, and obligation. Yet this expansion carried tension within it. Because power gained quickly often requires constant reinforcement. Not everyone accepted the new order without resistance. There were uprisings, most notably the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, a large and serious rebellion in northern England. Thousands of people gathered in protest, expressing anger over religious change, economic disruption, and perceived injustice. They were not simply reacting to abstract theology. They were responding to the visible effects of transformation in their daily lives. The crown responded with force and political calculation. Promises were made, then withdrawn. Leaders were punished. Authority was reasserted. The message was clear: the New England would not be reversed. This was the moment when Henry's revolution became irreversible. And yet, from Henry's perspective, this was not destruction, it was consolidation. He saw a stronger crown, a more obedient church, a more unified authority under his rule. The sacrifices made along the way were, in his mind, justified by necessity. The kingdom needed stability. The dynasty needed security. The crown needed control. At the center of it all remained the original question that had driven everything forward, the search for a secure future through a male heir. That future now seemed closer, because in the midst of religious upheaval and political restructuring, Henry's personal life had reached another turning point. Anne Boleyn had become queen. A new marriage had been formed, and the hope that had once been distant now appeared to have a concrete form. But history rarely delivers solutions without cost. The same forces that had elevated Anne to the throne would soon turn against her. And the New England Henry had created would reveal that even absolute power does not eliminate instability. It often concentrates it. And in that concentration, danger grows. Anne Boleyn's rise had been swift enough to feel like destiny. Her fall would be faster than anyone at court wanted to believe possible. There is a particular danger in Henry VIII's court that makes it unlike many other royal households in European history. Favor was not just influence, it was survival. To be close to the king was to be protected, elevated, and feared by others. But closeness also meant exposure to the king's shifting emotions, expectations, and suspicions. In such an environment, security was always temporary. Anne had entered that world as a force of change. She had not accepted the passive role expected of a royal mistress. She had refused to be a secret, and in doing so, she forced the king to reshape the political and religious structure of the kingdom around her. She became queen in 1533, crowned in a ceremony that attempted to present legitimacy and triumph, even as parts of Europe refused to recognize her position, because admiration in Henry's England always carried an undercurrent of calculation. Anne's position depended on one fragile promise, that she would give Henry the son he had waited for so long. That promise was not spoken aloud, but it shaped everything. It shaped expectations, it shaped pressure, it shaped time itself. When Anne became pregnant, the court held its breath. When the child was a girl, Elizabeth, the disappointment was subtle but real, even if carefully managed in public. A daughter was not a disaster, but she was not the answer Henry had built so much around finding. And after that moment, the atmosphere began to shift. In that compression, suspicion grows. At Henry's court, suspicion was never neutral. It was a force that moved through conversations, reports, and interpretations of behavior. A glance could become evidence. A rumor could become certainty. A political rival could become an accuser. Anne, once the center of attention, gradually became the center of scrutiny. Part of this shift was personal, part political, and part structural. Henry's expectations had not disappeared. If anything, they had hardened. The arrival of a daughter did not fulfill the dynastic solution he had sought. At the same time, the court remained divided between those who had benefited from Anne's rise and those who had opposed it from the beginning. Every faction understood that if Anne fell, the balance of power would shift again. And Henry himself, for all his earlier intensity, was not a man who remained fixed in emotional certainty. His attention moved, his patience wore thin. His interpretation of events changed under pressure. What once seemed like hope could begin to feel like disappointment. What once felt like promise could begin to feel like failure. In such a climate, small incidents took on larger meaning. Anne's sharpness of character, her intelligence, her refusal to be quietly absorbed into traditional queenship, traits that had once made her compelling, could now be reframed by opponents as arrogance, instability, or threat. Then came the accusations. They emerged gradually, in whispers before they became formal charges. Names were named, stories were told, allegations of infidelity and conspiracy circulated through court networks that thrived on secrecy and ambition. Whether these accusations were grounded in truth or shaped by political necessity remains one of the most debated aspects of Henry's reign. What is clear is that once they reached the machinery of royal justice, they acquired a momentum that was difficult to stop. Anne was arrested in May 1536. The speed of what followed is striking even in a court accustomed to volatility. She was taken to the Tower of London, the same fortress that had once received her as queen in triumph. Now it received her as a prisoner. The transformation of space is important here. The same walls that had once framed ceremony now framed accusation. The same river that had once reflected celebration now reflected uncertainty. The trial that followed was heavily shaped by the political structure that surrounded it. Evidence was presented. Confessions were obtained from accused men. The atmosphere was one of inevitability rather than suspense. Anne defended herself, but the outcome was already forming around her. On May 15th, 1536, she was executed. A clean break. But history is rarely clean in its meaning. Anne Boleyn's death did not simply remove a queen. It signaled something deeper about the nature of power in Henry VIII's England. It demonstrated how quickly favor could become fatal, how rapidly court politics could shift from celebration to destruction, and how personal relationships at the highest level of government were inseparable from the machinery of the state. It also revealed something about Henry himself. He had not hesitated to reshape the kingdom for Anne. He had broken with Rome, altered religious life, and redefined authority in England to make their marriage possible. Yet when that marriage no longer aligned with his expectations, he allowed it to collapse with devastating finality. In that contradiction lies one of the central tensions of his reign. Henry was capable of immense commitment to a vision, and equally capable of abandoning its human center when that vision changed. In the aftermath of Anne's death, the court moved quickly. The same system that had elevated her now erased her. Her name, once spoken with ambition and hope, became dangerous in certain contexts. Her marriage was declared invalid. Their daughter, Elizabeth, was redefined within the shifting logic of succession, and Henry, almost immediately, moved forward. Within days, he was already considering another marriage. This matters. It shows that Anne's fall was not an ending in the emotional sense. It was a transition point in a much larger process, the ongoing search for stability in a kingdom that had already been fundamentally transformed. The question that now lingered over everything was simple and unsettling. If a queen who had helped reshape England could be removed so quickly, what did that say about the nature of the power that had replaced the old order? The answer would soon appear in the form of Henry's next marriage, and the king's search for security would continue, unchanged in its intensity, even as the world around him grew more unstable. Anne Boleyn's execution did not end the logic that had created her rise. It only reset it. Henry VIII did not pause to mourn in a way the court could recognize as permanent. Grief, if it existed, was quickly absorbed into motion. The court adjusted. The ministers adjusted. The machinery of succession adjusted. What remained unchanged was the underlying pressure that had driven everything so far, the need for a secure future embodied in a male heir, guaranteed by marriage and protected by law. And so the search continued. Almost immediately, attention shifted toward a new queen, quieter, more compliant, and very different from the woman who had just fallen. In the space left behind by Anne's absence, Henry began to construct yet another version of stability. But the pattern was already established. Each attempt to secure certainty seemed to generate new uncertainty. This would reveal how deeply instability had become part of the crown itself. After Anne Boleyn's fall, the court did not return to calm. It recalibrated. Henry VIII did not move slowly in the aftermath of Anne's execution. The machinery of kingship rarely allowed for long pauses, especially in a reign defined by succession anxiety. Within days, attention shifted toward a new figure at court, Jane Seymour, whose presence had been quiet while Anne dominated the center of power, but who now began to move into that empty space with a very different kind of influence. Where Anne had reshaped the court through intensity, Jane emerged through restraint. Where Anne had demanded attention, Jane appeared to receive it. Where Anne had forced the world around her to change, Jane seemed to offer the promise that the world could remain stable if only it stopped resisting. Henry's interest in Jane was not the dramatic, consuming intensity he had displayed with Anne in her early years. It was quieter, steadier, shaped by exhaustion as much as attraction. The court had been through years of turbulence, legal battles with Rome, religious transformation, executions, rebellions, and the psychological strain of uncertainty about succession. Against that backdrop, Jane's demeanor appeared almost restorative. She did not project conflict, she did not challenge openly, she did not introduce new tensions into an already unstable environment. That absence of friction became its own kind of appeal. But beneath the surface, nothing in Henry's world was ever truly simple. Jane Seymour was not simply a passive presence in the story. She existed within the same political system that had elevated Anne and destroyed her. Her family understood the stakes of royal favor. Her position was shaped by court expectations, ministerial calculations, and the unspoken demand that she succeed where the previous queen had failed. The difference was not the absence of pressure, but the way pressure was expressed. In Jane's case, it was quieter, less theatrical, but no less real. For Henry, the central question had not changed. Everything still revolved around a son. The marriage took place in 1536, only days after Anne's execution. The speed itself is revealing. It shows how tightly Henry's personal desires were bound to political necessity. Stability was not something he waited for. It was something he attempted to construct immediately, as if delay itself might allow uncertainty to return. Jane's coronation as queen followed later, but her role in the court was already established. She was to be the opposite of what had come before. Where Anne had been polarizing, Jane was intended to be unifying. Where Anne had been associated with religious and political upheaval, Jane was expected to restore a sense of balance. Where Anne had failed to produce a surviving male heir, Jane's entire symbolic function became tied to that expectation. The pressure was immense, even if it was rarely spoken directly. Henry's court had learned to speak carefully around expectations. The failure of previous hopes had made language itself more cautious. But silence did not remove pressure, it only contained it. Then, in October 1537, the long-awaited event occurred. Jane Seymour gave birth to a son, Edward. The court responded accordingly. There was celebration, relief, and a sense that a chapter of instability had finally reached resolution. The kingdom now possessed a prince whose existence seemed to secure the future of the Tudor dynasty. For a moment, it appeared that the central crisis of Henry's reign had been resolved. But history rarely delivers resolution without cost. Jane Seymour's health declined rapidly after childbirth. In the same way that royal birth could be elevated into national significance, Royal death could compress personal tragedy into political consequence. Jane died shortly after giving birth, and in doing so, she became the only one of Henry's wives to be buried as queen and remembered in the court's official memory as the mother of the king's only legitimate son. Her death introduced a different kind of silence into Henry's life. Not the silence of failure, as with earlier losses, but the silence that follows fulfillment cut short. Henry's reaction to Jane's death was notably different from his response to Anne's. There was grief, but it was framed with an accomplishment. Jane had done what no previous queen had managed to do. She had given him a son. In that sense, her role within the political narrative of the reign was complete, even if her personal story was not. Edward's birth changed everything, and nothing at the same time. It changed everything because it provided the Tudor dynasty with a male heir, securing the succession in a way that Henry had long demanded. It changed nothing because it did not resolve the deeper patterns of the reign, the volatility of court politics, the instability of royal favor, or the structural tensions created by religious and institutional transformation. Henry VIII now had what he had long sought, but the nature of his rule meant that possession did not equal peace. The machinery of power he had built continued to move. Ministers still competed for influence. Religious change continued to unfold. International tensions remained unresolved. And Henry himself, now older, heavier, and increasingly constrained by health and temperament, did not become less decisive. If anything, he became more entrenched in his authority. Jane Seymour's story, brief as it was, marks a rare moment of fulfillment in a reign otherwise defined by pursuit. But it also exposes a deeper truth about Henry's England. Achieving the goal does not end the system that produced the goal. It only shifts its direction. And now that a son existed, the question was no longer whether Henry would secure the future. It was what kind of king he would become while raising it. After Edward's birth, something subtle but important changed in Henry VIII. Not his power, he already had that in abundance. Not his authority, he had reshaped both church and crown to reinforce it. What changed was the temperature of his rule. The early Henry had been expansive, energetic, even theatrical in his confidence. He jousted, celebrated, displayed himself as a Renaissance prince who seemed to embody possibility. The middle years of his reign were defined by pursuit, of annulment, of legitimacy for Anne Boleyn, of religious restructuring, of a male heir. But the later Henry was different. He was no longer reaching outward toward a future that might secure him. He was guarding what he had already forced into existence. That made him harder. Edward's presence stabilized the Tudor succession, but it did not remove Henry's instincts. If anything, it sharpened them. The achievement of a long-sought goal does not necessarily produce relaxation in a ruler who has spent years in uncertainty. Instead, it can produce a different anxiety, the fear of losing what has finally been secured. That fear began to shape Henry's later reign. He had already demonstrated that he could transform institutions when he believed necessity demanded it. The break with Rome, the establishment of royal supremacy, the dissolution of monasteries, these were not temporary measures. They were structural changes, and structural changes, once made, require maintenance. The machinery of the New England did not run itself. It required enforcement, loyalty, and constant reinforcement of authority. Henry now stood at the center of that system, not as a reformer, but as its ultimate guarantor. This shift had consequences for those around him. The court became more cautious. Ministers understood that proximity to the king was still the path to power, but also the path to destruction if misjudged. Favor remained essential, but it was no longer stable. It could shift with little warning, and the reasons for that shift were not always visible from the outside. Henry's temper, already present in earlier years, became more consequential in this phase. He was no longer a young king testing limits. He was a sovereign who had already crossed them. That changes the nature of decision-making. A ruler who has broken old constraints is not necessarily freer in a peaceful sense. He is freer to enforce his will without the same hesitation that previously existed. Within this environment, personal relationships at court became even more precarious. The lesson of Anne Boleyn had not been forgotten. Her rise and fall remained a defining memory for everyone close to the throne. It demonstrated that influence could turn to accusation, and accusation could become fatal in a very short span of time. That memory shaped behavior. It shaped silence. It shaped how people spoke and what they chose not to say. Henry himself did not become less politically active. He continued to engage with international affairs, balancing relations with France and the Holy Roman Empire. He continued to oversee religious policy in England, ensuring that the settlement he had created remained intact. But the tone of his leadership had changed. It was less exploratory, more consolidating. In this later phase, even achievements felt less like openings and more like responsibilities. The presence of Edward also introduced a new dimension to Henry's thinking. The future was no longer abstract. It was embodied in a child. That meant every political decision could be measured against its impact on succession stability. Wars, alliances, internal disputes, all of it now existed under the shadow of what would be left behind. At the same time, Henry's health began to decline. The physical transformation is often noted by contemporaries and later observers alike. The once athletic king became heavier, less mobile, increasingly limited by injuries and chronic conditions that affected his ability to participate in the active life he had once enjoyed. This physical constraint did not reduce his authority, but it did change how he exercised it. A king who cannot move as easily often governs more through instruction, delegation, and enforcement. That creates distance between ruler and court. Distance creates interpretation. Interpretation creates uncertainty. And uncertainty, in Henry's world, always carried risk. Yet even in this harder phase, Henry remained capable of decisive action. He did not become passive. He became concentrated. The later queens of his reign would reflect this shift in different ways, each representing a variation on the same underlying pattern. Henry's desire for control expressed through marriage, alliance, and succession management. But none of them would reshape the kingdom as dramatically as Anne Boleyn had, or resolve uncertainty in the way Jane Seymour briefly had. Instead, they existed within a system already defined by earlier transformations. The crown was stronger than it had been at the start of Henry's reign, but it was also more dependent on the will of the man who had created that strength. And that dependence created its own tension. Because as Henry became harder and more controlled, the space for flexibility within the system narrowed. Institutions that once mediated between king and country now answered more directly to the crown. Resistance became more visible and therefore more easily punished. Loyalty became more important, but also more fragile. This is the paradox of Henry VIII's later reign. Power had been centralized, but centralization does not eliminate instability. It concentrates it at the top. And as Henry VIII moved deeper into the final decades of his life, that concentration would shape everything that followed. From his final marriages to the succession he worked so hard to secure. The kingdom he had built was now fully formed, but its stability depended on a single remaining factor: the king himself. By the time Henry VIII entered the final stretch of his reign, marriage had ceased to be romance, alliance, or even experimentation. It had become administration. Each new queen was no longer simply a partner or a courtly figure. She was a political adjustment, an attempt to stabilize a system already reshaped by years of upheaval. The court understood this instinctively. So did Europe. So, increasingly, did Henry himself. The pattern had already been established. Catherine of Aragon had represented legitimacy and continuity. Anne Boleyn had represented transformation and rupture. Jane Seymour had represented resolution through inheritance. After her death, what remained was not emotional openness, but strategic calculation. And so the later queens entered a court that no longer believed in permanence. The first of these was Anne of Cleves. Her arrival in 1540 was not born from affection or long courtly pursuit, but from diplomacy. England was isolated in a dangerous European landscape. Alliances were necessary, and marriage remained the most direct instrument of statecraft. Anne of Cleves was selected largely on the basis of political strategy and portraiture, her image sent to Henry by his advisors to secure agreement. That detail alone reveals something important about this phase of the reign. Henry was no longer building emotional stories around marriage. He was responding to systems of counsel, negotiation, and geopolitical necessity. The famous portrait that influenced his decision became part of court memory precisely because it symbolizes how removed the king had become from the earlier intensity of romantic pursuit. When Anne arrived in England, however, the situation changed quickly. Henry met her in person, and the political calculation collided with personal reaction. The marriage was never fully realized in the way earlier unions had been. It was annulled within months. Anne of Cleves was not executed or destroyed in the manner of Anne Boleyn. Instead, she was separated from the political machinery and granted a quieter existence within England. This outcome itself is revealing. It shows a court that had learned something from previous cycles of destruction. Not every failed queen ended in catastrophe. Some were now managed, contained, redirected, but the instability remained. After Anne of Cleves came Catherine Howard. If Anne of Cleves represented diplomacy without emotional investment, Catherine Howard represented the opposite: youth, attraction, and courtly vulnerability. She entered the royal household as a young figure within the extended Howard family, and her rise was rapid. Henry, now significantly older, was drawn to her energy in a way that echoed earlier patterns in his reign. Yet the court that surrounded her was not the same court that had once elevated Anne Boleyn. It was more experienced in detecting danger, more familiar with the consequences of favor, and more alert to the risks embedded in youthful prominence near the king. Catherine Howard's downfall followed familiar lines within Henry's reign: accusations, investigations, confessions, and execution. But the meaning of her fall differed from Anne Boleyn's. Anne's execution had been tied to institutional transformation, the break with Rome, the restructuring of authority, the assertion of royal supremacy. Catherine Howard's execution, by contrast, reflected a court that had already internalized those changes. It was no longer about creating a new order. It was about managing behavior within an existing one. In that sense, her death marks a shift, not toward revolution, but toward consolidation through fear and discipline. By the time Henry married his final queen, Catherine Parr, the nature of queenship had changed again. Catherine Parr entered a court shaped by exhaustion and experience. She was older than Henry's previous wives at the time of their marriages, and she brought with her a reputation for intelligence, education, and a degree of political caution that had become essential for survival. By this stage of the reign, survival was not an abstract concept, it was the defining condition of court life. Catherine Parr's position was unusual in that she was not simply a symbol of dynastic ambition. She also played a stabilizing role within the royal family itself. She helped maintain relationships between Henry and his children, including Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom occupied complex positions within the succession structure Henry had created. In doing so, she contributed to a quieter but important phase of the reign, the maintenance of continuity. Yet even this calmer phase existed under the shadow of Henry's earlier decisions. The religious settlement remained in place. the monarchy still held authority over the English church. The dissolution of monasteries had permanently altered land ownership and local structures. The nobility remained reshaped by redistribution of wealth. The kingdom was stable, but it was a stability built on earlier disruption. That is the defining paradox of Henry VIII's later queens. They did not create the transformation of England. They inherited it, and they operated within its constraints. Each marriage reflected a different attempt to solve the same underlying problem: how to align the personal life of a king with the political demands of succession and stability. But by this stage, marriage could no longer resolve the deeper structure of the reign. The foundations had already been altered too extensively. Instead, queenship became a kind of negotiation with an established system. Some survived briefly. Some were removed quickly. Some adapted successfully. But none could return England to its earlier shape. As Henry's health continued to decline, the political function of these marriages became even clearer. They were no longer about expansion or transformation. They were about management, of succession, of court stability, of royal image, and of the fragile balance between competing factions. And beneath all of it remained Edward, the long-sought heir whose existence had once seemed to resolve the central crisis of the reign. But even a secured succession could not eliminate the underlying volatility of a kingdom reshaped by one man's will. Because Henry VIII had not simply created a line of inheritance, he had created a political world in which inheritance itself depended on constant reinforcement, and that world would soon face its final test. By the time Henry VIII's reign reached its final phase, the image of England had changed dramatically from the cautious kingdom he inherited in 1509. It was no longer a state defined by survival. It was a state defined by assertion. Yet assertion came at a price. The same transformation that had strengthened the crown internally, its control over the church, its absorption of monastic wealth, its centralization of authority, also pushed Henry into a more ambitious posture on the European stage. A king who had broken with Rome and declared himself head of the Church of England could not easily appear subordinate or passive in international affairs. Authority, once expanded at home, tended to seek recognition abroad. This is where war entered the later Henry VIII's story, not as a novelty, but as a consequence. Henry's military campaigns against France and Scotland must be understood within that broader context. They were not isolated bursts of aggression. They were expressions of a monarchy attempting to translate internal transformation into external recognition. In 1513, early in his reign, Henry had already demonstrated martial ambition with a campaign in France. That early success, more symbolic than decisive, helped shape his identity as a warrior king. But in his later reign, warfare became more complex, more expensive, and more difficult to sustain. The simple confidence of youth gave way to the logistical and financial realities of sustained conflict. War against France required enormous resources. England's economy, still adjusting to the redistribution of church wealth and changing land ownership patterns, was placed under strain. Armies had to be raised, supplied, and maintained. Fortifications had to be built and reinforced. Naval capacity had to be expanded as England increasingly looked toward control of its surrounding waters. At the same time, the northern frontier with Scotland remained unstable. Border conflicts were frequent, shaped by long-standing rivalry and shifting alliances. Scotland's relationship with France, the so-called Old Alliance, meant that English policy in the north was never entirely separate from continental dynamics. The result was a kingdom under constant financial and administrative pressure. What makes this phase of Henry's reign particularly significant is not simply that he engaged in war, but how war functioned within his broader system of rule. Military ambition was tied to legitimacy. A king who had broken from Rome and redefined religious authority needed to demonstrate strength in other forms. Victory abroad reinforced authority at home. Defeat risked undermining it. Yet the outcomes of Henry's later military efforts were mixed. There were moments of success, including territorial gains such as Boulogne. But there were also costly campaigns that strained royal finances without producing lasting transformation. The English crown was powerful, but not omnipotent. Its ambitions often exceeded its practical capacity. This tension between image and reality is central to understanding Henry's later years. On one level, the crown projected confidence. Grand fortifications along the coast, assertive diplomatic posturing, and the rhetoric of a sovereign kingdom standing independently in a divided Europe. On another level, the underlying system required careful financial management, shifting taxation strategies, and continued redistribution of resources from earlier religious reforms. Within this environment, empire was not yet the global structure it would become for later English history. Instead, it existed as aspiration, an emerging sense that England could define itself as more than a peripheral European kingdom. Naval development, overseas trade, and increasing attention to maritime power all pointed toward a future that was not fully realized in Henry's lifetime, but was beginning to take shape. The dissolution of monasteries had unintentionally contributed to this shift. By transferring wealth from ecclesiastical structures to the crown and its allies, Henry had created new economic actors who were more directly tied to royal policy. Landowners enriched by redistribution had incentives to support stability and expansion under the Tudor regime. Power was no longer solely ecclesiastical or hereditary in the old sense. It was increasingly tied to royal favor and administrative integration. Yet even with these changes, the costs of war remained substantial. Every campaign required justification, resources, and political support. Every setback risked undermining confidence. Every success needed to be measured against its financial burden. Henry's later government had to operate with a level of administrative sophistication that his father's reign had only begun to develop. This is one of the quieter but important legacies of Henry VIII, the strengthening of the machinery of state through necessity. War did not simply drain the kingdom. It forced it to become more organized, more structured, and more capable of sustaining large-scale national projects. But organization did not eliminate strain. It managed it. By the final years of Henry's life, war had become less about expansion and more about positioning. England was asserting itself, but carefully. It was powerful, but aware of limits. It was ambitious, but increasingly dependent on internal stability. And internal stability depended once again on succession. On Edward. On the fragile certainty that the Tudor line would continue beyond Henry's death. Henry had reshaped England in profound ways. But shaping a kingdom is not the same as securing its future. And as his health declined further, the distance between achievement and uncertainty began to close again. The cost of glory, in Henry's case, was not simply measured in coin or conflict. It was measured in how much of the future had been placed into a single fragile line of inheritance. And that line would soon have to carry everything he had built. In the last years of Henry VIII's life, the court began to feel less like a place of expansion and more like a place of arrangement. Everything had already been decided in principle. The break with Rome had been completed. The monasteries had been dissolved. The royal supremacy had been established and enforced. Wars had been fought, treaties negotiated, queens married and removed. What remained was not transformation, but maintenance of what transformation had already created. And at the center of it all stood the most important construction of Henry's entire reign, the succession. Edward. But even a secure heir did not eliminate uncertainty. Edward was a child, and a child could not yet rule. That meant Henry's final years were not simply about celebration or closure. They were about structuring a future that he would not live to oversee. This is where the politics of Henry's reign becomes especially revealing. Kingship, in its most stable form, is not only about commanding the present. It is about controlling what remains after the ruler is gone. Henry understood this better than most. His final will, therefore, was not merely a private document. It was a political architecture. It was an attempt to extend his authority beyond death, to stabilize succession, to define governance during Edward's minority, and to ensure that the fragile achievements of his reign would not collapse into factional struggle. The question was no longer whether the Tudor line would continue. It was who would control it before Edward could take the throne himself. Henry's court had always been a place of factions, but in the final years, those factions began to orient themselves around the approaching vacuum of power. The king's ministers, noble families, and political allies all understood that once Henry died, authority would temporarily shift into a fragile interim state. That period would determine the stability of the entire realm. Henry attempted to manage this in advance. His will laid out arrangements for governance, balancing competing interests among the nobility. It named individuals who would exercise authority on behalf of the young king. It attempted to prevent any single faction from dominating the regency. It reflected a long-standing concern in Henry's reign that division at the center of power could undo the stability he had worked to create. But wills, even royal ones, exist in tension with political reality, because they are written by one mind, but executed by many. And those many minds do not always share the same priorities. As Henry's health declined, his physical condition became increasingly visible at court. The once athletic king, who had embodied Renaissance ideals of vigor and display, was now constrained by illness and limited mobility. This physical decline added urgency to the political environment. Everyone understood that transition was approaching, even if no one could predict its exact timing. Yet Henry remained intellectually active in governance. He continued to issue directives, oversee policy, and enforce the structures he had created. The machinery of the state he had built did not slow simply because its creator was aging. In fact, in some ways it became more tightly controlled, as if the act of governing itself could delay the moment of succession. Within this environment, the final question of Henry's reign was not dramatic in the theatrical sense. It was structural. Could the system he created survive him? The answer depended on several fragile conditions. Edward's survival, the stability of the regency arrangements, the loyalty of the nobility, and the continued enforcement of religious and political settlement across the kingdom. Each of these conditions carried risk. Each depended on human behavior in a moment when human ambition was likely to intensify. Henry's will was an attempt to reinforce those beams before his death. But no will can fully govern the future, not even a king's. As 1547 approached, the atmosphere at court shifted into anticipation mixed with restraint. There was no open collapse, no immediate chaos. Instead, there was waiting. Waiting for succession, waiting for confirmation, waiting for the moment when authority would pass from one life to another. Henry VIII had spent his reign reshaping England to align with his vision of monarchy, church, and succession. Now that vision was about to be tested without him, and the final outcome would depend not on his will alone, but on whether the structures he built could hold under the weight of a new and uncertain era. Henry VIII did not leave England as he found it. That much is beyond dispute. What is harder to measure is the depth of the change, because it was not confined to one institution, one policy, or even one generation. It reached into the structure of authority itself, into the relationship between ruler and ruled, and into the way England understood power, faith, and continuity. When he died in 1547, the kingdom did not pause. It transitioned, but it transitioned into a system he had already rewritten. Henry began his reign as a conventional Renaissance monarch within the European order. He ended it as the architect of a distinct English sovereignty. That shift is the central outcome of his life. Yet it came through contradiction. He broke from Rome to secure a marriage annulment, not to found a new church. He dissolved monasteries to strengthen royal finances and authority, not to remake English social life. He pursued war to enhance prestige and legitimacy, not to construct a long-term imperial strategy. And he centralized power to stabilize succession, even though that centralization made future transitions more dependent on the strength of individual rulers. Each decision solved an immediate problem. Each solution created longer consequences. That pattern defines the architecture of his reign. The search for a son was not just a private obsession, it was the engine of constitutional change. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and the later queens were not simply individuals in a royal household. They were points of pressure within a system being forced to adapt to one man's demand for continuity. Their lives intersected with diplomacy, religion, law, and war, because succession itself sat at the intersection of all those forces. And when Edward was finally secured, the pressure did not disappear. It shifted. Because a secured heir does not guarantee a stable future, it only guarantees a future that must still be governed, defended, and interpreted by others. That responsibility fell to the structures Henry left behind. The England he created was more centralized, more assertive, and more internally controlled than the kingdom he inherited. The monarchy held authority over both political and a religious life. Land and wealth had been redistributed on a vast scale. The nobility had been reshaped by favor and policy. The church had been transformed into a national institution under royal supremacy. But this strength carried a hidden fragility, because so much depended on the crown itself. Henry had reduced external dependencies, but increased internal concentration of power. He had replaced shared authority with centralized authority. He had created a system that functioned efficiently under strong leadership, but required careful management during transition. That transition began immediately after his death. Edward VI was a child, and childhood in a political system designed around monarchy is a form of vulnerability. The regency that followed would test whether Henry's structures could withstand the absence of their creator. It would reveal tensions that had been held in suspension during his lifetime. It would show whether the religious settlement could endure without his personal authority enforcing it. And it would determine whether the England he built was truly stable or merely contained. But those outcomes belong to another story. Henry's story ends not with resolution, but with consequence. A kingdom reshaped, a church redefined, a succession secured at the cost of extraordinary upheaval, and a legacy that cannot be reduced to triumph or failure alone. He was a king who pursued certainty in an uncertain world, and in doing so, he changed the shape of that world so thoroughly that certainty itself became more difficult to achieve. What he left behind was not simply a throne passed to his son. It was a new definition of monarchy, one that England would never fully return from. And in that sense, Henry VIII did not merely rule his kingdom. He rebuilt it in his own image and then handed it forward, still unfinished, still unstable, still alive with the force of everything he had set in motion. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, be sure to like the video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe for more deep dives into the people, civilizations, battles, myths, and moments that shaped our world. Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Your perspective might inspire a future video. Until next time, keep exploring history, because the past is never truly gone.